The commutative law says that changing the order of addition does not change the sum. The commutative law says that changing the order of multiplication does not change the product. The associative law says that changing the grouping in addition does not change the sum. The associative law says that changing the grouping in multiplication does not change the product. The distributive law says that multiplying a sum equals multiplying each part and then adding. The identity property says that adding 0 does not change a number. The identity property says that multiplying by 1 does not change a number. The zero property says that multiplying any number by 0 gives 0. The inverse property says that a number plus its additive inverse equals 0. The inverse property says that a non-zero number times its reciprocal equals 1. The order of operations rule says we follow a fixed priority so expressions have one value. The rule of equality says you can add the same number to both sides without changing a true equation. The rule of equality says you can subtract the same number from both sides without changing a true equation. The rule of equality says you can multiply both sides by the same number without changing a true equation. The rule of equality says you can divide both sides by the same non-zero number without changing a true equation. The inequality rule says adding the same number to both sides keeps the inequality direction the same. The inequality rule says multiplying both sides by a positive number keeps the inequality direction the same. The inequality rule says multiplying both sides by a negative number reverses the inequality direction. The divisibility rule for 2 says a whole number is divisible by 2 if its last digit is even. The divisibility rule for 3 says a whole number is divisible by 3 if the sum of its digits is divisible by 3. The divisibility rule for 5 says a whole number is divisible by 5 if its last digit is 0 or 5. The divisibility rule for 9 says a whole number is divisible by 9 if the sum of its digits is divisible by 9. The fundamental theorem of arithmetic says every whole number greater than 1 has a unique prime factorization. The Euclidean algorithm is a method that finds the greatest common divisor by repeated division. The angle sum theorem says the interior angles of a triangle add to 180 degrees. The exterior angle theorem says an exterior angle of a triangle equals the sum of the two remote interior angles. The triangle inequality says the length of one side of a triangle is less than the sum of the other two sides. The Pythagorean theorem says that in a right triangle, the square on the longest side equals the sum of the squares on the other two sides. The converse of the Pythagorean theorem says that if the side lengths satisfy that relation, the triangle is right. The vertical angles theorem says opposite angles formed by two intersecting lines are equal. The linear pair theorem says two adjacent angles on a straight line add to 180 degrees. The angle around a point rule says angles around a point add to 360 degrees. The corresponding angles theorem says corresponding angles are equal when a transversal crosses parallel lines. The alternate interior angles theorem says alternate interior angles are equal when a transversal crosses parallel lines. The interior angles theorem says same-side interior angles are supplementary when a transversal crosses parallel lines. The parallel line criterion says if corresponding angles are equal, then the two lines are parallel. The parallel line criterion says if alternate interior angles are equal, then the two lines are parallel. The congruence rule SSS says triangles are congruent if all three corresponding sides are equal. The congruence rule SAS says triangles are congruent if two sides and the included angle are equal. The congruence rule ASA says triangles are congruent if two angles and the included side are equal. The congruence rule AAS says triangles are congruent if two angles and a corresponding side are equal. The hypotenuse leg rule says right triangles are congruent if the hypotenuse and one leg are equal. The isosceles triangle theorem says the base angles of an isosceles triangle are equal. The converse of the isosceles triangle theorem says if two angles in a triangle are equal, the opposite sides are equal. The midsegment theorem says the segment joining the midpoints of two sides of a triangle is parallel to the third side. The midpoint theorem also says that midsegment has half the length of the third side. The similarity rule AA says triangles are similar if two corresponding angles are equal. Similar triangles have proportional corresponding side lengths. The proportionality theorem says a line parallel to one side of a triangle cuts the other two sides proportionally. The converse proportionality theorem says if a line divides two sides proportionally, it is parallel to the third side. The central angle theorem says a central angle equals the measure of its intercepted arc. The inscribed angle theorem says an inscribed angle is half the measure of the corresponding central angle over the same arc. Angles in the same segment of a circle are equal. The diameter theorem says an angle subtended by a diameter at the circle is a right angle. A tangent to a circle is perpendicular to the radius drawn to the point of tangency. Equal chords in a circle are equally distant from the center. Equal chords in a circle subtend equal central angles. The probability addition rule says the probability of A or B equals the probability of A plus B minus the overlap. The complement rule says the probability of not A equals 1 minus the probability of A. The average rule says the mean is the value that makes the total deviation sum equal to 0.